Welcome back to News and Views. I'm your guest host and presenter, Tahir Mayepa. We are now going to continue with our program for this morning. We are heading into Africa. Zimbabwe health deal. This is one of the most amazing stories that have come out of Africa in a very long time. It is said that Zimbabwe has made a headline after rejecting a whopping 350 million health deal with the United States. At a time when many economies are under strain, such a decision raises important questions about sovereignty, political alignment, and strategic positioning within a changing global world. And we are now going to be joined by our guest, Dr. Gideon Chitanga, who's going to assist us to understand why would Zimbabwe refuse such a lot of money, a money that most African countries and African presidents will not even hesitate to grab. It has been the tradition in Africa that we are basically a bunch of begging nations, and whatever that the West throws at us, we grab it with open arms. But here we are, Zimbabwe saying no to $350 million. Dr. Chitanga, help us out here.
Yes,
Welcome
I
to
think
Salam Media.
thank you and good morning. Well, I think money is not what we live for, right? And governments and states bear a very big responsibility to exercise discretion over what they take and what they don't accept. Aid and donor funding has been a perennial problem in African countries in terms of conditioning domestic politics, foreign policy, economic interests, and so on and so on. I can go on and on. And this case that we are talking about is quite fascinating because we know that a few months ago, President Trump stopped US aid, billions actually of dollars, and most of which was directed to African countries. Then he restructured that aid to align it closely with the US interests. What is coming out of this deal that we are talking about now is suggestions that there are quite intense demands that or conditionalities that are tied to this aid. The government of Zimbabwe has spoken about the request from the US side to provide data and all the information about the beneficiaries from the aid. That's one thing they've said. The other thing is that they've said there are some conditions that are tied to trade in critical minerals. So the US is basically using this aid, health aid, to get access to critical minerals with actually all the countries that have been offered this. I know that the DRC has accepted other countries in the Sahel, Zambia. There is actually pressure from civil society to try and get the government to be clear about whether it has accepted this offer or not. So what the government of Zimbabwe is saying, this offer endangers the sovereignty of the nation. It subordinates Zimbabwe to provide certain resources that should be protected under the constitution of the country and not provided to external parties. It undermines the privacy and the rights of Zimbabwean citizens. And by the way, data has become such a huge commodity that is in demand because it's used for all kinds of sophisticated things, from security perspectives, finance, and so if a country surrenders control over the data that it has of its population, it has basically surrendered control of of that population to a foreign nation, which is really a key definer of sovereignty, control over a state, a bounded state, in its geographic terms, but also in its political terms, in as far as it refers to the citizens of that country.
Yeah, quite interesting. Mentioning the issue of data being a commodity, and obviously we've seen it even during the COVID years, that there was this demand for data from especially African countries, with regards to the statistics, and even in South Africa we were keeping all these statistics and all that, and some of them were given out. But going back to this donor funding, when do you think that African countries will grow enough to be able to less depend on donor funding? Because if anybody gives you money, it doesn't matter who that person is. Are they not correct to say that for me giving you this money, here are my conditions for that money? It doesn't matter how good or bad that demand is. And now it takes us back to us being self-sustaining. Shouldn't we be working towards self-sustainment instead of us continuously having this back and forth with especially the United States insofar as donor funding?
Yeah, aid is not necessarily free money, or donor funding is not necessarily free money. There are always exchanges that happen. So you get aid from your partners because they get a preferential treatment in other sectors, let's say elements of policy or trade and so on and so on. So you are correct to say that this is not free money. The second thing is, traditionally, aid from the US and other Western countries has always come with conditions when it comes to African countries, and you can contrast that with China, really, that provides aid without the burden of a lot of conditionalities. The last part is you talk about cutting the dependence on other countries. There is a certain level of dependence that will always happen, because countries are actors that have to exchange or to transact or engage in the business of politics. They do engage in economics, they engage in diplomacy. So aid, just like trade and other things, these are currencies of international relations, if I can put it in that way. But you can reduce dependence, right? A lot of health budgets in African countries, they are heavily sustained by external funding, either from the US or the European Union and other parties. And your question actually raises one of the major challenges that we face as African countries. Why and how can we not fund our own interests, not only health, education, and every other sector? I believe that we have a lot of money and we have a lot of resources that is basically wasted, because we have a deeply entrenched psychological imperative to chase certain material things that are not necessarily important or in the national interest. So there's a good chunk in a lot of African countries, there's a good chunk of a budget that goes to sustaining the lifestyles of political elites and other parties in corrupt ways. If you are a leader and you just block corruption at the top and target to save or reserve that money, trust me, that money would be enough to fund a health budget. In the case of Zimbabwe, if you have followed the media in the past 2-3 years, you have seen stories of shocking levels of corruption, and these resources accumulate in the hands of a few key elites who are protected by the same government that is rejecting this donor funding. If they plugged that corruption, or at least ensured that a certain percentage is charged, say from the trade in minerals, these technology companies, they pay a certain percentage and they get tax rebates for it. So it comes down to the mechanics of how you do it. They can raise enough money to sustain the budget in Zimbabwe. If they are going to look for donor aid, that donor aid becomes supplementary. The crisis now is the health system in Zimbabwe has collapsed. There are few private institutions that are extremely expensive, which are well resourced, and the rich people can access them. But the poorer people, the majority of whom are suffering with HIV and AIDS and other conditions, they do not have access to medicines. And that is where this contradiction is. The government saying, we want to protect national sovereignty, and that is understandable, but you are not doing enough to provide for the health of your people. That's a contradiction. And I dispute this idea that African countries are poor, they don't have money, and so on, because I believe that there's just a lot of money floating in the wrong hands, and some of it illegally or accumulated illicitly. And this money should be channeled into government resources that can then be allocated for key strategic interests, whether it's health, it's education, for the purposes of industrialization or manufacturing or agriculture. We don't do that enough as African countries. We are okay with allowing corruption to flourish, seeing our political elites living luxurious lives beyond their means without questioning. And these luxurious lifestyles are funded by public resources, which should be directed to benefit the citizens.
I want to take that point further. We're just going to take an ad break and we'll be back in a minute.
Right now, over 150 million children around
Salam Media, keeping you company this Ramadan.
Welcome back to News and Views. I'm your guest presenter, Tahir Maepa, and I'm joined by Dr. Gideon Chitanga. We are busy talking about Zimbabwe's health deal. Dr. Chitanga, flowing from what you just said, tell me, is this about sovereignty or conditions or geopolitical alignment, this refusal?
Now, so the idea of sovereignty, I think, ties together the geopolitical pressures that the US is trying to exert using its health aid on African countries because they are dependent, and there is an understanding that there is a need for health provisions in these countries. Part of the conditions which are said to be tied to this deal is to allow the US carte blanche access to critical minerals. And by the way, African countries also contribute quite a huge chunk of these critical minerals and rare earth resources that are demanded for technological reasons by mainly industrialized countries. And the US and China are at the top of the chart. So the US is trying to extend its influence by basically under the Trump administration engaging in these bilateral agreements that bind these developing countries to conditions where they access the resources that the US, the financial resources that the US provides. You provide the data related to the key recipients of the health aid, which might mean a lot of people, a good percentage of the population, if not the whole population, depending on the structure of the aid, what it does, what it provides, and so on. The second element is access to natural resources. So sovereignty relates to a country having control over its own resources, not only just people and the politics and the institution. And by conceding to such conditions, allowing carte blanche access to natural resources, these countries basically lose control over these resources. They cannot wake up tomorrow and say, well, we can trade with you, the US, but we can also trade our resources freely with other parties who are interested in these resources, even if it meant that it would be profitable to engage with other parties. And I think this is where the problem is. But a deeper part of to further expand on geopolitics, we are living in a world that is slowly shifting from what we used to call a unipolar world, meaning a world that was dominated by a single superpower, which was the United States. And there are other powers that are emerging economically and politically stronger. There are strong security institutions and systems. China is one of them. Russia is another. There are what we call middle powers, countries in the Middle East. Unfortunately, they are in a war now. India is a big player, and where African countries have traditionally depended on the US and its allies, they realize that they can do business with a lot of other parties to maximize the benefits to their own citizens. And at this stage where we are in, there is a bit of intense competition or rivalry between the major powers, the declining power, the US, and others that are emerging. And the rules are quite fluid. They are not clear. So Big Brother is traditionally trying to rely on the same powers that he has used previously to continue to extend and entrench his dominance. It will be upon African governments, really, like the government of Zimbabwe has chosen, to seek to define the rules by independently asserting their own authority and making key decisions that allow them to maximize the opportunities that are emerging from the changing situation or the changing geopolitical landscape.
How does this reflect Harare's foreign policy direction, or is this just one of those freestyling stunts by the government, like a pay-as-you-go, deal with circumstances as they come, or are they consistent with their foreign policy objectives?
I like how you frame it, and I hope that in the future I can use this term, introduce this term in international relations and diplomacy, freestyling. It's quite an interesting one, because Harare traditionally has had a very robust, clearly defined foreign policy that was very pro the global south. He supported the interests of developing countries, especially under President Mugabe. You see, but when the new government came into power, their foreign policy was simply, we are open for business. So they basically embarked on freestyling economics. And I think this differentiates it from free market economics. This is a very opportunistic, calculated way that is very transactional and lacks robust principles. So maybe to add to your question, at this stage, what we are missing is a principled stance that would define a credible pro global South foreign policy in the context of Harare. And I can give a lot of examples. Under President Mugabe, in fact, historically, the ZANU-PF government was very closely supportive or mutually supportive with liberation governments in the SADC region, in the African continent, other countries in the global south. They were very clear about calling the major powers to account and uphold international law and human rights in as far as the rights of the people and citizens of the global south were concerned. Mugabe was very assertive about the question of sovereignty, whether it's political, economic, or in whichever sphere. We have not seen this from President Mnangagwa. I remember debating with friends about the tensions between South Africa and the US. And I keep thinking about that and wondering, even at the peak of that problem, in Zimbabwe, the political actors within ZANU-PF were more concerned about keeping in line with the US, not even coming out to share solidarity with South Africa, which really found itself under intense pressure, despite the fact that South Africa, under President Mbeki, even President Zuma, played a key role to help ZANU-PF to, in ways that allowed ZANU-PF to retain power in the 2000s. Mugabe would have been very vocal about what is happening in the Middle East, the removal of the head of state in Venezuela. President Mnangagwa was actually in an interview where he was asked by an American journalist, I think it was in Dubai 3 weeks back, about the stance of his government as regards the removal of Nicolas Maduro. If I can paraphrase his response, it was something like, we read these things in the newspapers, we are not so sure what is happening, we are far away from them. Basically saying Zimbabwe is not involved. So you cannot claim or seek to assert sovereignty in isolation, because we are small countries, we don't have the power. What we need is to be consistent about calling the big powers to abide and play by the rules, and this has not happened. I agree with you that this is an isolated case that reflects some opportunistic calculation rather than a clear foreign policy posture that is aligned with principles and values that can be located in a certain consistent foreign policy posture. This idea of being open for business simply says we can take money from anywhere, wherever it comes from. we don't care who you are as long as we can make profit. But a country cannot betray its own principles and seek profit from everywhere. The other element that they have said is we want to use our resources to do business with any other country that we choose, which is okay. But it is, I think, expected that where principles are, you then can see growing convergence among not only domestic political institutions, but also internationally, in the sense of bringing certain countries together in relationships that are based on their values, their beliefs, their principles. The current Zimbabwean government, he has been all over the place. They've not been really been able to define consistently their principles, and because of that, you cannot think of anything other than freestyling, opportunistic freestyling. And there could be reasons why they do that. I think principally they don't want to be accountable either to the citizens in Zimbabwe or to their international partners. So we'll not account to our own citizens, but we'll also not account to the other players that want to do business with us. If you want to impose conditions, or if you bring business that is compliant with the interests of the political elites, will do business with you. So they are doing business with places like Belarus, supporting agriculture, but there's a lot of opaque things that happens in that space. The citizens are not clear. They will be told that we are buying trucks for public health, agricultural implements, and that's it. And there's speculation of about what Zimbabwe pays. Does Zimbabwe pay in minerals? Does Zimbabwe pay in cash? What is the value of these trade relations? Who benefits from them? It's not clear. Zimbabwe has been exporting a lot of platinum until last week. I understand the government has stopped all the companies for now, but that was a very opaque, massive operation that involved a lot of elites aligned to the government, and really no one took account to let the citizens know to structure these exports of minerals properly. They talk about beneficiation. It has not yet happened. It's a good thing, but we have not seen a clear process and structure as to how the citizens of Zimbabwe can benefit from that. I said earlier that there's a lot of money in developing countries, including in Zimbabwe. Mining, particularly critical minerals and rare earths, where they are available, should be able to at least provide a certain percentage that can support other sectors. We have not yet clearly seen that. So what we see is a sign of foreign policy freestyling, and the problem is you cannot really touch the outcomes and the benefits of it.
Dr. Gideon Chitanga, Research Fellow at Maximilians University, thank you very much for that insight. We really appreciate.
You're welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. We're now going to take an ad break, and we'll be back with our third segment of the show.